hello everyone, welcome to the latest edition of the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christiaan Kutlik.
And this is normally where we would say what the topic of the show is, but we're going to do something a little different this week. We wanted to thank everyone for all their support over the last couple of weeks. We are finally on most major podcast platforms.
Yeah, we've really expanded in the last month or so, along with our content, I think.
Yeah, it was a couple of nights of me not sleeping that much, but we pulled it off. And we also were really happy to get added to both Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts really quickly, which is not common.
Really? I thought it seemed pretty seamless for us.
It did seem pretty seamless, but I've read it's not always the case. So thank you to everyone, if any of you Google or Apple folk who pushed that through are there.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. If you'd like to support us further and you're a new listener, check out the dissectingfiction.com website. We do have a t-shirt up, and that will help fund all this wonderful podcastingness. And if you are an interested party for sponsorship, you can also contact us through the site.
And we also put up content on the site from time to time. That's kind of been our hub for all our content, including articles and our podcasts.
Yeah, and there's going to be a couple of articles coming up in the next few weeks. With all the Halloween stuff, we got a little behind on our normal output with the articles, but they will be returning. Back to the subject at hand. Today's episode is about the cinematic Joker.
Which is, the cinematic Joker, which expands several decades. When you first pitched this idea, I didn't really think about that. But then when I was thinking, Cesar Romero, I was like, man, this is going to feel like the 60s. That's 50 years of the Joker just on the silver screen.
Yeah, the Joker, is obviously one of the most popular characters in history. We wanted a way to kind of address it without trying to address all of the Joker's many appearances in comic books and other media.
But there's 3 Joker books right now.
Okay. No, it's not even exaggerated. Yeah, literally coming out from DC right now. I think there are 3. And they're all oddly shaped Black Label books, I think.
Including the John Carpenter one?
Oh, well, that's only a one-shot.
Oh, okay.
That's out. But yeah, we have Jeff Lemire. Harleen, and then there's a Joker Harley thing that's also...
Yeah, and then Harley has her own Poison Ivy book, too.
Oh, is that coming to... Jeez. Alright, well... Well, clearly the character and his cast are still making money for DC.
Yeah, and that's why we wanted to focus it just to the cinematic universe, because...
It's just too much.
Yeah. He also, oddly, the Joker seems to be symbolic of a lot of, issues at the time, or even just, attitudes.
Yeah, we'll get through a lot of that, but we'll rewind a little bit here. What's kind of cool is the image of the Joker, pretty widely known to be based off of Conrad Veidt's performance in The Man Who Laughs. Now, character-wise, not really similar, but if you look at those early Joker images and you look at photos from that film, it's there.
I think it has a lot to do with the lips, mainly, and that was just, a thing that's evolved over them.
Yeah, and definitely the darkness under the eyes, which is, more pronounced, especially in the earlier Joker art. It does exist further on, and if you look, in the 70s, it kind of comes back pretty harshly again with, the sort of dark bags under the eyes.
Yeah.
But those are all pretty directly taken from The Man Who Laughs. What I think is interesting, and this is something going off of the cinematic a little bit, but I think establishing the origins of the character are important. Jerry Robinson, who created the Joker, contrary to what some credits say, was a lit student at Columbia when he was working on Batman. And he said that he was trying to create sort of an ultimate threat for Batman.
I'd say he succeeded extraordinarily well.
Yeah, but what I think is most interesting about that is it's almost like Lucas on Star Wars, where story-wise he was just aiming for the thing that was going to appeal the most to the most people. And that's kind of what Robinson did with the Joker.
Yeah, because especially in those early issues, he's not really a super developed character. But it is interesting how he just looks like a cool character. And I think that's kind of contrasts really well with just Batman's really stark, bold look. And then you have the Joker, which is a lot more flamboyant and colorful.
It also is a nice little irony that the character who's the brighter, sort of goofier character is really the evil one.
The most evil one in many, many canons.
Now I think, we have the character sort of explained as much as we can with that little, because he changes so much. First big screen appearance of the Joker is Cesar Romero's version in Batman the movie, which premiered in between the first 2 seasons of the Batman TV series.
I like the Adam West 60s Batman, like, a lot. I think it's very fun and goofy to look at, but I don't think this version of the Joker is very emblematic of, like, the Joker as the whole.
I would agree with that as far as what the Joker becomes in sort of pop culture. But it's a pretty good reflection of what was going on in the comics.
It just has, like, a lot of overlap with, like, the Riddler. It's a very, like, campy thing where he's playing tricks and things like that. You see that early, like, idea of him just being kind of a chaotic character. Not nearly as, like, violently chaotic.
Right. He's definitely chaotic, but it's all like gags.
Yeah, like it's surprises, you know. Like, here's a jack-in-a-box. It's a bomb! You gotta throw out the bomb.
As fun as Romero's mustached Joker performance is, the only actors on that show who I think start to kind of go a little further than this well-written camp are really Gorshin and maybe Adam West. Frank Gorshin as the Riddler, I think, actually has levels. Takes it to a sort of a place that it never was before.
You can kind of see that, like, he's not just playing this as just like a job, like a lot of these other guys on the show were.
And the Riddler really kind of takes the forefront of the villains in the 60s Batman series, which may be the only thing about that Joker performance that I don't think you should construe it as disappointing, because it is what it is and it's fun. The Joker doesn't have the gravity he will later.
No, absolutely not. I don't think any of the characters really have the same gravity. This is the same movie that has the bat shark repellent.
The 60s Batman series is a lot of fun, and I think there are a lot of things we could dig into. But as far as the Joker goes, I don't think there's too much to say outside of how much it fit that version of Batman.
Yeah, it feels like more of a Ronald McDonald villain than anything else. Like, I don't think even his, like, style or anything has carried on that strongly throughout the ages.
I would say maybe the biggest contribution is sometimes in other media when they're voice acting the Joker, you do get a very Romero sort of old school thespian delivery that he does. I think that's probably your biggest contribution, because for the most part, that version of the Joker was really taken from the Silver Age comics. So, a few years pass, not nearly as many as it probably seems, but in 1989, Batman becomes probably the biggest pop culture touchstone of the year.
There's a lot of reasons why the 1989 Batman movie was so successful, and it kind of helps start the superhero craze that we see today.
A big part of that is Jack Nicholson's Joker, which in itself, and this is a trend we're going to kind of begin here, isn't quite the comic book Joker.
This was taking influence from, like, the 80s comics, where there's a lot of different interpretations going on. It doesn't exactly take from the Killing Joke or anything like that. They weren't quite the cultural touchstones or anything at that point.
Yeah, and if you ever listen, it always seems like that's, what Burton always talks about is the Killing Joke Joker, and that's not really the Joker he presents.
No, he let Jack Nicholson really take the role in his own direction, and I think it really comes out well because of that, because Jack Nicholson makes a much more cultured Joker, I would say, because there's a scene where he's in the museum and he's bashing all the paintings, and then the one painting he doesn't destroy is the Francis Bacon painting, which is like a really violent postmodern artist. At least in terms of painting, he's not like a violent guy. And I always like that moment because he points at that painting and it's like a really ugly painting. He's like, destroy everything except for that one. It's
more of an exaggerated Jack Nicholson than it is really any version of the Joker. And it establishes an origin for the Joker, which I don't think is a problem.
I think Jack Nicholson was doing a lot of his, like... Because he was playing a lot of detectives for a long time, so I think he kind of put that gumshoe into the Joker, kind of making him like just like a street-level thug that just happened to fall into all this power. And even though he's a street-level thug, he does know things. He is a smart guy. He just happened to be like in this kind of shitty situation.
Not to make this entirely about the economics, but holy crap, did Jack Nicholson end up making a ton of money on this movie. I've heard... there's no solid number out there because obviously a lot of that's going to be protected. I've heard on multiple occasions that the reason Jack Nicholson can do whatever Jack Nicholson wants to do is because the movie basically has funded him since.
Yeah, I think that's partly why he's so proud of this role. I would imagine, like, how much money it's made him. It's kind of been legendary.
Well, I can't imagine you wouldn't be proud, especially with what we were saying, that it is sort of this exaggerated him, where, like, he's taking the character in a direction that's going to work for him. And so when that's successful, I mean, I think, a certain amount of pride is reasonable.
And also, like, the way they designed the Joker in this film, like, they kind of stretch him out a lot. Like, especially that smile is a much more, like, it's scary looking. Like, they kind of stretch it across his whole face.
Yeah, I think that's probably the first time people outside of comic readers had this idea of the Joker being someone who's disfigured. You both have the chemical disfigurement and then the plastic surgery that, we never see what was originally wrong, which I always think is kind of cool. But the only way they can fix it is to pull his face into this, like, bizarre smile.
It works just the right way, and that is, like, very off-putting. It's a really cool, iconic look.
Arguably, out of the live-action Jokers we've gotten, and I would say even if you're counting the couple of TV live-action appearances, it probably is the closest to the comic book.
Yeah, at least during that time. I'd also say, like, it's also interesting to see, like, how the 80s kind of perceived the Joker at that time. And I think this is kind of like a good symbol of that, where it wasn't super dark, but it was just dark enough. It was kind of playing with the stuff that was introduced in the 60s and kind of twisting it a little bit.
Yeah, it's almost an attitude of that Joker that it's like, oh yeah, all this is terrible, but who cares? Money is flowing.
Yeah.
Which is a kind of very 80s
The Berlin
idea.
Wall fell. Yeah. Russia's over.
Yeah, like it's that, the whole trust sequence is really playing off of that, where you have the person you absolutely should not trust, and it seems like people are starting to trust him.
Yeah.
The 89 Batman is this huge success on multiple levels. I think, growing up in the 90s, one of the few superhero things you could really get away with wearing constantly was like a bat symbol. And that's all a result of 89 Batman. In between, Warner's is looking for ways to kind of capitalize on this. One of those ways was Batman the Animated Series. In 1993, they were supposed to release a direct-to-video movie for the series, hoping they would get this crossover adult child market that they had on TV. Because Warner Brothers is looking for something big, they asked that they make it theatrical, and it does not do well at all. A lot of people blame kind of lax promotion on it.
It came out pretty suddenly from what I've read. This came out the year I was born. I was probably like 3 months old when this happened. So I kind of went back recently to watch it. I was kind of shocked by that there's blood in it. There's all this kind of violent stuff in it. It was really surprising to watch, especially when I've only had passing familiarity with the original Batman animated series.
I mean, I was sort of the opposite. I was fully entrenched in the series at the time and kind of have continued to be. Yeah, it is even a little darker than what they could get away on television, which was the point of making it direct-to-video originally, because they knew they had that adult market. It just didn't succeed. But it gives us the opportunity to talk about Mark Hamill's Joker.
Yeah, I think between Jack Nicholson's Joker and Mark Hamill's Joker, these are probably the two most iconic. Because later down the line, I feel like they're very much different interpretations. And Mark Hamill's Joker and Jack Nicholson's Jokers are tentpoles of every Joker since then.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think in large part Hamill's Joker is such because it was driven by this idea of trying to create, the Joker, of having on the animated series, they're always looking for the iconic versions of these characters. And it's as much his performance as it is the writing, I think, for Mask of the Phantasm's Joker.
And the art style, too, I would say. Just because, again, I think the whole Batman anime series art style is just iconic in of itself, even now.
Yeah, it's that sort of simple that lets you fill in the gaps, where it's not, bland. It's just giving you the basics of the image so you can make it real in your head.
Also how Mark Hamill kind of plays with the Joker. I know he doesn't write the character or anything, but he kind of mixes the Jack Nicholson and the Cesar Romero Jokers together to make this kind of he does tricks on you, but he also might just stab you at the same time. And that comes across a lot stronger in the movie than in the animated show.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you get the grounded Nicholson Joker from the Hamill Joker, especially because they give the Joker a very similar origin to his origin in the 89 movie and Mask of the Phantasm, which I think is appropriate. I mean, at that point would be the most familiar version of the character. But he does, in the performance, have a little Cesar Romero in there. It's just, as you said, he kind of can go darker. And I think what makes it even more effective is he can go darker on sort of the flip of a coin. Like, you kind of don't know what you're going to get with Hamill's Joker.
It's like a rubber band. Like, he'll go far and be violent, but he always comes back and, like, taps it off with, like, a blank punchline or something. Like, some kind of, like, 50s punch, like, my meatloaf is cold again, or whatever. After he, like, pummels Batman's face in.
Yeah, and it's
a poor example, but you get the point.
And that, extends all the way through the animated series, a little into Justice League.
Yeah.
This version of the character becomes, regardless of the failure of the film, it becomes one of the most relevant versions of the Joker, even to this day.
And if you haven't seen Mask of the Phantasm do it, it's an incredible, incredible movie, I think. And it is interesting to see Joker as kind of like a side villain in this movie, because it's almost more about Bruce Wayne, which you rarely get out of Batman movies.
Yeah, and I thought that was maybe a little bit of a comment from the crew from Batman the Animated Series towards the Burton films, where the Burton films are very much about the villains.
Yeah, Burton notoriously hated Batman as like a character.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot about Burton's approach that, obviously extremely successful, and I can't sit here and act like I don't watch his 2 movies at least once a year. There's a lack of reverence that occasionally sort of damages things. I mean, we could really get into that probably to another podcast if we ever want to do, which if you guys want to hear that, we'd probably really enjoy doing a Burton Batman podcast.
Yeah, it's oddly fascinating, especially his iconic style.
Especially now so distanced from it. You can kind of see where Burton just went, I don't care about this.
Yeah. As for how like the Joker kind of plays into the 90s, it's kind of a much more cynical approach to what was even in the 80s. Because it's much more about like... it's not quite a deconstruction, but it is kind of like a weird commentary on what came before.
That the 90s often looked back at past eras as if they were irrelevant. There was that, 90s attitude. And I think that definitely did play into sort of the way the public would have perceived the Joker at that point. Though I would say there's almost too much reverence to the material in Batman the Animated Series to really accuse them too much of that. They were, if anything, they were not trying to be like the extreme 90s.
No, it's not like taking it down. It is oftentimes like for Mr. Freeze, they had to give him a whole backstory and everything to even make him like remotely interesting. Right,
and then that backstory ends up sticking and becomes the backstory.
Yeah.
Well, superhero films do not fare terribly well during the 90s.
And that's a whole podcast in of itself.
That's an entire podcast in itself. I'd love to cover 90s superhero movies because I own almost all the American ones except for The Phantom because that Blu-ray is really expensive. And they're all trying to be Batman and
but
not
they're so
succeeded.
Weird, yeah.
Yeah, there's
weird.
varying levels of quality. A lot of times you have really competent productions without good scripts. There's just so much variation. But we don't get back to the Joker until the end of Batman Begins in 2005.
The big reboot after the failure of Batman and Robin. So, Batman and Robin is super campy, super out there, kind of hated, but I have a guilty pleasure for it.
Yeah, I think now that it's not the last Batman movie, you can go back and watch it and be like, oh man.
Yeah,
the Pharaonic Man is in this. Like, it is completely batshit crazy, to pardon the pun.
The neon bike race.
Yeah, just watching it now, it's just like, this is real. They spent millions of dollars on this. Like, I went to Warner Brothers Studios a couple of years ago, and they had the cars from it, and I, bugged out, because I'm like, this is amazing. Look at these things that they spent all this money on.
Yeah, and all there is, just a little silver lining on it.
Yeah, it's incredible, but there was this bad taste in everyone's mouths for a little while. There were a couple of false starts, but eventually we get Christopher Nolan's Batman Begins, which reestablishes the character, is a very big movie. That's another podcast in itself talking about those. But at the end of Batman Begins, it ends with something very, very similar to the end of Batman Year One, with Gordon presenting Batman with the Joker's calling card, which literally could not have driven me more crazy for 3 years. Because Because you just saw this Batman movie that actually felt like Batman, and then there's the Joker, but not yet. You don't really get it. And that tease, I think, is more effective than any of the Marvel stingers, just because you just got an entire movie that was, first of all, it was about Batman, which is great. That was extremely competent, and I don't know a single comic book fan that wasn't happy with it.
I think it also helped with like how much they established the setting of Gotham, because they went through great lengths to make Gotham feel like a shithole.
Right. Which, you know, is kind of implied in the other ones, but you're always like, it also seems like they have laser ships in Gotham. And like,
yeah,
Nolan's Gotham was very gritty. It was very dark. I think shooting in Chicago always helped that, because having lived in Chicago, I can tell you this weird thing I noticed. You know, having been in New York night after night when, you know, in college, when I didn't mind staying out that late, and then living in Chicago, Chicago is literally a darker city. Like, there just aren't as many lights. And I thought that was, like, genius. Like, I don't know where the motivation to place most of, you know, the location shooting in Chicago was, but I can't imagine that wasn't part of it. It is just a darker city.
I also think it has to do a lot with the architecture, because if anyone lives in New York is constantly being like, everything's being torn down and built back up again. Like, things don't stay the same for more than like 2 years, but in Chicago it feels much more like static.
I would agree.
Yeah, but much more of the like 1920s Art Deco still remaining from that era.
So, you know, they introduced the idea of this Joker, which everyone knows is how you complete Batman. If there never was a sequel to Batman Begins, it's still the most appropriate ending. We are introduced to the Joker in the very beginning, the opening sequence of The Dark Knight, which in itself was released separately because it was such a big deal. I think what is interesting, where you see a shift in the intention of how to tell the Joker's story, is the fact that when we start The Dark Knight, the Joker's already the Joker.
They don't show you his face for quite a while in The Dark Knight before you actually understand he's the Joker. But you, even that first shot where you see the clown mask, you know, right then and there, that's the Joker. But like the fact you don't see him or anything keeps you guessing. And I think that's a really smart idea, because this plays a lot on the idea of like the Joker being the polar opposite of Batman. And by not giving him an origin compared to Batman's like movie long origin, I think is a very good decision.
It's also a really easy way to make him sort of a force, where you're not perceiving him as a person because all you see are these terrible actions that he's committing. But as the film kind of stretches on and you start to get these weird little philosophical speeches, it makes you wonder who this guy is. I think that's the strength of this version of the character, that at first he's just the Joker, and then you start sort of wondering, like, who the hell is this guy? And on top of that, you get the literally Oscar-winning performance from Heath Ledger.
Heath Ledger put a lot of, like, not to say anything about his tragic death, which really helped propel this film to, like, box office, like, records. But, like, Heath Ledger's performance, he put a lot of, like, nice touches that is still kind of taught in film school today. And just, like, things like him licking his lips, the way he, like, walks around is very, like, unrestrained. Like, even in the beginning, like, when he's shooting people, like, he's kind of just, like, flicking his hand up. He's not really doing anything that's very, like, appropriate. It's just kind of very, like, loosey-goosey.
Ledger himself said that he was playing the character with zero empathy, which I think is the important thing. It's not so much that the character doesn't have motivations. They just don't care what happens to anyone else.
Or even himself, really.
I suppose so. I always think that that's always at the end of the day, he probably would try to save himself, even if he's acting like he's not interested. I don't know. That's interesting, especially with the ending of the film where it's Batman who has to save him.
He wants to break the Batman, at least morally, which has been a thing since, like, the 80s, really. You really see that come out in the 90s with Mark Hamill's Joker.
Yeah, I mean, it requires the villains being sort of terroristic enough where you have to make the audience question whether it's okay to leave them alive.
Yeah, and I think that does a great job, because the Dark Knight's Joker is very much like a post-9/11 Joker, in that he is a terrorist in the film itself. Like, he's a terrorist of Gotham. He's blowing things up kind of randomly. And that invokes a lot of, like, the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, all those US wars, where Al-Qaeda just felt like an unknowable force, but clearly they were based in something, but we couldn't really understand them. And I think the Joker brings that out. Like, clearly the Joker has a motivation. He talks about it all the time, but it's kind of this vague, unknowable thing that's hard to wrap your head around.
that argument is only furthered by the fact that you then have a Batman who feels that he has to intrude on everyone's privacy to stop this because we don't understand the threat. Yeah, it's a little on the nose.
That's a separate comment. I don't think the film really explores it all that well. Because it comes in at the very last moment, like right before the final fight. It's like, oh yeah, now I'm invading everyone's privacy. We're deleting it anyway.
Yeah, I feel like we definitely do need to do a podcast on the Nolan Batman films because there's a lot to unpack in each movie.
Yeah, really.
But the Joker, that version of the Joker, it's gonna take a little more time to see. We're, a little more than 10 years out. I have a feeling that version of the Joker is going to end up next to the Hamill and Nicholson versions.
It definitely has. This sent shockwaves through the superhero genre. This Joker specifically, just because it's so iconic and how much he tested the hero emotionally, not just physically, which is a lot of what the Marvel movies does. They physically test the heroes, but they don't often emotionally touch the hero.
Yeah, and
I think morally.
I think it sort of arguably does the same to the audience, too. I think if there is something very clear in The Dark Knight, which structurally is extremely interesting and exactly why we should do this podcast, but, you are playing the Joker not just against Batman as you typically do. You're playing against Harvey Dent, who is not yet Two-Face, becomes Two-Face. You're playing him against Rachel. You're playing him against the police. You're playing him against everyone who could be the hero. And he basically breaks everyone but Batman.
Yeah, that's true. Even then he breaks Batman's public image because of the way he has to beat the Joker and save the idea of Gotham's hope. He has to become the villain.
Just a couple of things, and some of this is sort of more rumor, and I like to always preface this, but consistent enough rumor that it's worth talking about. One of the things that popped up a lot right after The Dark Knight was that apparently in the show Bible for these films, there may have been something specific about the Joker being ex-military, and that's where all of this comes from. That, it's, the soldier who becomes the terrorist type theme. It does get lightly referenced in some of the merchandising from that era. There's a couple of books. One that sticks out in my head is the Dark Knight Manual that have, fake documents and different things. And there is mentioned specifically in there that he may have had a past as a military, I would guess, special ops type idea. So I wouldn't doubt that was something that they presented. Supposedly there's a lot of that with Nolan's scripts where there are a lot of things that the cast knew that they were told that other members of the cast didn't know because it would be you have this knowledge and that character doesn't, so you don't want them to act that way against each other.
Yeah, that's a very method acting way of directing.
Other thing that is, I want to say David Goyer confirmed this at some point. It's just something that popped into my head, so I apologize for not doing the research up front. That the judge role in Dark Knight Rises, which ends up being Scarecrow, was supposed to be the Joker. Which is cool because it's sort of a reference to Batman the Animated Series. Yeah. And also would have finally given someone the opportunity to play the Joker twice.
I would have, I was about to say, I would have been interested to see how the Joker evolves, because it feels like Heath Ledger put a lot of background in this character that we never get to see. And I would have liked to at least have interviews where he talked about a bit more of his approach to this Joker.
Yeah, it really is a shame with his early passing. Because, you talked about how much his passing may have helped the film. I almost believe that it would have been as big without his passing.
I just think it passed into a mythical level.
Okay, I would agree with that. Because now this is what, we're talking about that right now. It would be fascinating now, over 10 years later, to hear Heath Ledger talking about the motivations. And the truth is, almost no one does.
The surprising restraint.
There is surprising restraint. There, even when they release new Blu-rays or whatever, you get very, very little extra than what ended up on screen about any of those three movies. And that could be intentional on Nolan's part to try to keep the mystique for as long as possible. But the truth is, if they all keep it forever, then we'll just never know.
And I'm fine with never knowing, because that's kind of what makes this Joker so interesting, is that the fact we don't know. And there is an interesting through line through all this where, the 80s Joker was very much all about his past. This is how he's doing his blah, blah, blah. 90s Joker, a little bit. It doesn't, even the Mask of Its it feels kind of irrelevant to the larger picture. It ties him in with the plot But, it doesn't really matter how he became the Joker. And now here, it feels like he was always the Joker. Like, he was born the Joker.
And it also, as you were saying, it makes him as big of a force as Batman is.
Yes, absolutely.
I think maybe in the 89 film, he is in a way, because they make Batman kind of neurotic. It's almost like they make Batman less of a force, so that Joker kind of matches him. And this is where you end up with Nolan's sort of grand, theatrical Batman facing his real equal. We have this stunning Joker performance. No one is going to touch that for a while. Until Marvel movies start making a ton of cash. Yeah. And DC goes, hey, let's try to do this too. The Joker does not appear until 2016's Suicide Squad. We've already gotten Batman at that point. A Batman who is very much like Frank Miller's Dark Knight Returns Batman, kind of rearranging the timeline a little bit, but it's a more than fair comparison considering how many nods to those comics ended up in Batman vs. Superman. So we are introduced to Jared Leto's... Leto?
I thought it was Leto.
Leto. Jared.
Leto.
Our buddy Jared. We're introduced to his version of the Joker in Suicide Squad, initially through these sort of weird, vignettes at the beginning of the movie, which are probably the best part of the movie.
This version of the Joker was very much like a response to the Dark Knight Joker. At least I feel like, where he was trying to bring out this weird, chaotic force of a villain.
Yeah, so we don't get a lot of this Joker.
No, but his presence hangs heavy over the entire film.
I would agree with that. Visually, kind of similar to the Dark Knight Returns Joker as well, but with lots of tattoos on top of him, and then... not really any sort of tonal or thematic similarities to that version of the Joker.
I think he was trying to just, make it seem like a much different force of chaos, like a much more underground force of chaos.
And there's definitely an intent to try to make him sort of hip.
Yeah, I think this has, that's a good, there's a much more of a hip-hop influence.
Which is funny because if you think about the way they play the Joker in 89, it's not, terribly distanced from what they tried to do there either, where they made him, the Joker in 89 had a bunch of thugs who were wearing, gang jackets with his patch on it and dancing around with boomboxes. It's...
Yeah, but that felt ironic. That felt like a joke in itself. But here, this feels very serious.
Yeah, this is the Joker. That the Joker is the man with the purple Lamborghini. which I saw and is gorgeous, by the way. But
I imagine that looks better not color corrected to hell.
Yeah. But I think you're right that Suicide Squad, which, by the way, is a successful film money-wise.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it is. The interest in this version of the Joker was definitely there. I think, for the short time he's on film, he doesn't do anything that's too abysmal.
No, it's just very weird.
Yeah.
Because he'll be there's that scene where they're in the strip club and he's like, oh, do you want to see Harley's tits? And the gangster goes, no. And then he's like, come on, you want to see her tits? No. And then he shoots him anyway. And it's just I don't understand the motivation behind any of this.
So I guess that, in a way, is sort of a Joker-y thing, where it's all right, well, I don't understand what this guy's doing, and...
Yeah, but that feels like a very, dumb way of, looking at the Joker. Because, all these Jokers are very, chaotic, but, they're kind of chewing the scenery, and there's a bit of a point, and it's just kind of, off-put people. But here it just feels, very random. And that's not, how these other Jokers approach things. They're very calculated, despite how chaotic they seem.
Right, and I think, maybe that's where it didn't connect, is regardless of the fact that you should hate the Joker.
Oh, yeah.
There always ends up this weird, pop culture, respect for the Joker, which I think is a little sick, but I can't act like I've never played in, as a teenager, alright, gotta tell you something super dorky about me.
Alright.
So when I was in high school, every year I would get, my notebooks for the year, and they'd be different colors. And I would, whatever the color was, I would then theme it to a character. So, I will be the first to admit that I think in my junior year of high school, I had a purple notebook, which I then would take, very, very nice transparent tape and print pictures off the internet of that character and make a collage on the cover. So, we all buy into that Joker idea, especially, I think, young men, are drawn to this idea of, complete chaos.
Yeah, I think it's a very, like, how people approach, like, serial killers and stuff. There's, like, a strange fascination about these people that, like, kind of exist outside of society. And that's very much what the Joker embodies, but he embodies it in, like, a different way, in that he only exists because Batman exists.
See, but I don't know if... We'll get into that, because we can get into that a little bit in the next film.
He is definitely the most iconic in that, like, Batman's order, Joker's chaos. And I think that's partly why it feels so hard in Suicide Squad, because you don't have that Batman balance for, like, the Joker to really find a rooting in.
And he never seems an equal to Batman. You have that one scene where they're fighting. He
just seems like a thug that had, like, really bad plastic surgery.
It seems like the thing that Batman had to deal with that night.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. And, like... him being a thug is not too different than many of these origins, but in a way, like, the way these actors kind of pulled on that thug origin played out very differently, and here it's very literal. It's
all in that nuance. It's all in, Nicholson's Joker was that thug, but then he becomes unleashed. Arguably, Ledger's Joker's no better than a thug, but he's plotting and specific, and he knows what he's doing even though you don't.
I think he's also not having fun with this, because we'll get into the behind the scenes stuff.
Yeah, so being that we don't have a lot to talk about as far as Jared Leto's screen time, a lot of the interesting stuff has popped up. We're going to go with the confirmed thing first, and we're going to talk about some of the rumors. We know for a fact, I'm just going to list different gifts that Jared Leto sent to cast members of Suicide Squad. Here we go. A pet rat for Margot Robbie. Probably the nicest of the gifts. Because rats are really nice pets. And
they can be if you take care of them.
You can train them. Alright, so not too bad. Dead hogs to many members of the staff. Anal beads. He sent anal beads.
Used, I believe.
Oh, anal beads. Here we go. Used condoms and anal beads. I don't know if that used applies to the anal beads, but they were...
I would imagine.
And apparently he didn't really talk to anyone.
No, famously he had to be addressed as Mr. J on set. No one could call him by his name, his actual name, or even as the Joker. He had to be called Mr. J.
Which is fascinating method acting that seems to have resulted in very little.
Yeah, it's strange how hard he, threw himself into this role. Without, any sort of plan. I can't imagine him doing post-interviews and being like, oh, I was going for this. Especially compared to, all these other actors where you, talk to them about the Joker and they have, a reverence for it. I had a lot of fun with the role. I got to explore some, weird emotions. Here it's just, I send my colleagues a dead rat because that's what the Joker does and the Joker's random. I send them used anal beads because that's random and gross and the Joker would totally do that because he's random.
It's interesting. We're talking about, Nicholson as this exaggeration of Jack Nicholson. Maybe if that's your wavelength for random, it might be more of a comment on you. I don't know.
Yeah, and this is not surprising from the lead singer of 30 Seconds to Mars. I think his sense of, borders have been eroded as a rock star.
But that's, it's funny because he even commented directly on that. He said, there's supposed to be no boundaries for this character, and that's why I did those things.
None of that's actually in the film. Allegedly, they cut a lot of that out, right?
I know that it has been confirmed there were at least 3 cuts of the movie. I've heard more, but it's been pretty established from David Ayers that his cut was very, very different from the one that hit theaters. He's commented on it publicly a bunch of times. He's, not disappointed that the film was still a success, but
it's not his version.
It wasn't his version of the film, and maybe, if his version of the film came out, we've been having an entirely different conversation about the Joker right now.
Yeah, because it seems like a lot was left on the cutting room floor. And then, as for the Joker himself, how this fits in with, the era he came out of in, this feels very much like a post-superhero Joker, where this weird reverence, where it just feels like this is what people's, weird idea of the Joker is. And it's very uncritical and very idolatrary.
Yeah, and I think, if we want to pull anything thematic out of what we got out of this Joker, this is a Joker where the Joker used to be the sort of focal point. This is a Joker that's dealing with the fact that, the Marvel Studios movies have become the superhero movies when Batman used to hold that pretty tightly. It's almost like this Joker that, is born of a need to get more attention.
Yeah, it's a very attention-seeking Joker, and it's also like a very toxic Joker too. Like basically everybody in this film he pushes away.
Right, which is,
which is a weird commentary.
David Ayer
himself.
has commented that his version of the film was very much about Harley Quinn realizing that. So if we lost all of this storytelling with the Joker and Harley Quinn, and the focal point was supposed to be Harley Quinn realizing how terrible this guy was, maybe we are missing something here to what Jared Leto was trying to do. Maybe he was trying to create this character so repulsive that your main character had to get away from them. Because it would really turn the Joker into Harley Quinn's villain instead of Batman's villain.
Yeah, and that's kind of like, that's where the evolution has been going for quite a while, just because I feel like these studios have been trying to disassociate Batman from the Joker and trying to make Joker his own thing. And Harley Quinn has been a big part of that. We talked about with our New 52 episode, where Harley Quinn has not been disassociated with Batman, but has become her own character.
That was only 2016, which blows my mind. Now in 2019, we get something very, very different from Warner Brothers concerning the Joker. Really, in that time, Warner Brothers had to kind of put away their plans to try to directly compete with what Marvel Studios is doing.
Yeah, they basically had to blow it all up.
Right, but they've had good results. So we can't say, like, Aquaman was a huge success, Shazam did well, they have Wonder Woman sequel on the horizon. There's a lot going on in the studio. What we got was Joker from Todd Phillips, both writer-director on this, portrayed by Joaquin Phoenix. I think this might be the most interesting version of the Joker to ever hit the big screen.
There's a lot to, like, I think this Joker's interesting because of the way he acts with the world directly, because usually we see Joker interacting with, like, Batman, and that's mainly been what he's been responding to, but this Joker is very much about, like, what made him, how does he react to things, This is very much more of a character study, and I think that's why he's probably a very interesting Joker.
What I really enjoy about this film, and, it's worth mentioning, it had the highest award at the 76th Venice International Film Festival.
Which is crazy to think about.
It is crazy to think about. To me, what drives this movie had to be, and they've admitted this to a certain extent, that they knew it's hard to get anything that doesn't look like an out-of-the-box success made anymore, with like a decent budget. So it seems like they kind of took a look at what characters were around that you could kind of pitch the studio on, and went, alright, if the Joker existed, what would that guy actually be? Like, who would this person be that could do this? And I think from that point, I know there's been a lot of criticism and a lot of talk, even from people involved in production, that this isn't a comic book movie. I kind of disagree.
Yeah, I think them trying to say it's not a comic book movie is appeal to, like, the highbrow crowd. And people that kind of look down on comic book movies, recently Martin Scorsese made some comments.
And he clarified them in the New York Times a little more. And I think what's funny is I'll actually bring that back around with that type of commentary. Look, I am 100% against thinking that comic books can't be highbrow. I think, we just did podcasts on Jonathan Hickman, which I think is half of his stories are more complex than anything in television and film.
Yeah, absolutely. Just watch Batwoman, and you can see the stark difference.
Oh, jeez. Let's not get into that right now. The comment that they were trying to make, and Scorsese, to his credit, in the editorial he did for the New York Times, clarifies this. It's not so much the idea of superheroes, supervillains that is the issue. The issue is you have studios pumping out these movies that are formulaic, and they're not exploring what the cinema could produce for them. Because they're staying incredibly safe. It's not to say that the craft isn't there. It's not to say that they're not effective for what they're doing. It's to say that the exploration that cinema can provide is not being provided.
I think, that's a good way of putting it, because this Joker kind of feels like, or at least 2019's Joker, feels like something comic book movies could be. This is like, if you really wanted to go in an art direction, Joker could be like that.
That little bit of grounding makes a lot of the public feel like it's not capturing the sort of exaggeration that comic books often use to make their points. But I would totally disagree in Joker. I think Joker is grounded, but part of the beauty of it is when you get those little, like, weird things about the world he's in. Like, the fact that they're mentioning these giant rats, and if you're looking, the giant rats are there. And they're giant.
Yeah, they are.
It's not like these are regular rats running around. These are, like, giant giant rats, though I have seen rats that big occasionally in the city.
I thought people were joking about the giant rats.
And there's also, like, little things like that are what make it is... I was watching Phillips show, like, the opening sequence for, like, a thing for Vanity Fair, and he mentioned that what they did was they took the shots that they were shooting in Jersey City, and then they made sure that there was no open air space in the back. So you would see buildings where in reality there aren't buildings, because they were trying to create this idea of, like, Gotham being this, untenable, just monstrous city, that if you lived in Gotham, all you saw was Gotham.
It is a very claustrophobic movie, and I think that's why, like, this is much more of like a working class Joker and him kind of being like suffocated by like an unyielding system.
Yeah, and it's a commentary on, how the public perceives mental illness. Mm-hmm. But I don't think it ever exonerates him. It never, says that he's doing the right thing. It's just that the world is terrible and terrible people come out of it.
Yeah, and I think that's why when this movie came out, there was all this arguments about, incels kind of shooting up the theater and things like that, because that happened with The Dark Knight.
Right.
But I don't think the movie motivated him. I think it was just it's a filled theater,
Which is, in a lot of ways, almost the comment the movie is making. That it's, all of this is going to produce bad things eventually.
Which it has been. This is very much like a post-Trump, post-Sandy Hook movie. Where it's talking a lot about, mental illness and where it kind of stems from and how the system fails people in many, many ways. And I think that's why there was so much fear about this, because, in many ways, when incels, if you've watched things about that stuff, they're always talking about, how they feel failed by the world.
But then there's that turn, too, where take, the police officers in the film, who are genuinely trying to do the right thing.
Yeah.
Who are not harassing him in any unreasonable way or anything. They're not, going after him. And he still turns on them. And I think that's a comment in itself is, yes, there are all these problems, and if we solve these problems at the core, you can fix a lot of society's ills. But it doesn't make all of society responsible for what happens after.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. I also see it as a jaded man who's been kind of worn down by a jaded world, kind of being unable to deal with sincerity because he's so used to people being mean to him, especially how ridiculously awful his life is in this movie.
There's a lot of layer commentary. I mean, look, obviously we've already started to delve into spoiler territory, so if you don't want to continue listening, I think we're about to really start talking about things that get revealed through the movie. There is, that question at the end of the film of what happened and what didn't. And I kind of like that in this scenario because it's enough... There's enough there where it's a question instead of it being an insult because we don't have a way out of this.
I see. I think it's a cheap way out of it.
Really? I didn't think it was in this case.
Because for me, it's kind of I feel like him just saying he imagined it all or it was all pretend. It kind of removes itself from the point it was trying to make beforehand.
I would disagree. Because I think for him, the only thing I think we could say we know at the end of the film is that he's in the asylum, which means something happened. Now, if it's the way he saw it, if it's exaggerated, is where you don't know. But I think that's sort of the commentary, as weird as this sounds, on Batman. Because it's a proof, first of all, that we don't need Batman to exist for something like this to happen. Which I think is probably the coolest comment of the movie because so often that's not the comment made. And I think it's a valid comment that you don't need Batman to have the Joker. The Joker can happen. But I also think that that's sort of the commentary on the comic book Batman and Joker, is that this exaggeration could be any number of things. You could have a situation that gets as violent as the riots at the end of that film. Or you could have had just a guy down on his luck shoot two guys on the subway and end up in the asylum.
Spend more time speculating what was imagined, what isn't imagined, and it feels kind of like an internet thing, rather than discussing the themes in itself.
I disagree because I think it's a platform to discuss the themes because I feel like that's what we're doing now. The other thing I would add to that is a big part of what happens at the end, whether it be fantasy or it be what ends up actually occurring in that world, which in itself, now we're getting into this total meta thing. But It's the death of Thomas and Martha Wayne. The Joker, who appears in this film, desperately wants that to happen. It may or may not have happened. But that's like a huge comment on Batman because it means that someone out there is willing this. And is the result then good because of all this chaos? I don't know. I thought that was fascinating.
I think it's interesting because you could say, like, oh, maybe the Joker in this movie did kill Thomas and Martha Wayne. And that's a comment on, like, how he is as the Red Hood in, like, many continuities. And, like, it just feels distracting to me in many ways. And it's not to say, like, I don't like obscure or, like, hard to follow films. I really love 2001: A Space Odyssey. Apocalypse Now is all about, like, insanity and things like that.
You know what my favorite part of 2001?
Which one?
It's when the baby destroys the earth. The giant baby.
It doesn't destroy it, he rebirths it.
Honestly, I totally misinterpreted that movie.
Everyone does. I probably misinterpreted it. I feel like discussing like what is and isn't real like distracts from like the more interesting aspect of like how society reacts to the Joker, or how like the Joker becomes this weird like totem pole for people's frustration, and like this post like gun control society and like Trump and shit like that.
But here's my counterpoint to that.
All right.
You know, we've discussed this idea of the Joker, you know, whether he's more effective or less effective with or without an origin. You create a scenario in this movie where you make his origin so questionable that you don't even know who he is at the end, even though you've watched him the entire time.
But if that was the point they were going towards, maybe they should have made him more questionable.
I think it is pretty questionable. You start to see those flashes pretty early in the film, where if you're looking, you'll go like, hey, wait, why is he... I just saw him in an asylum. Why is this not being addressed? It's there. It's just... I agree 9 times out of 10, I'd be totally on board with you that it would soften the ending. To me, in this case, because of the journey that it goes on, I think it does fortify it. So we have a good place to end on this sort of highfalutin Joaquin Phoenix Joker.
Maybe we'll go back to the dumb Joker with Birds of Prey coming out.
Oh, no, that's not what I was hearing.
They just blacklisted him from the studios.
Here's one of the rumors that Jared Leto was not at all happy about the Todd Phillips Joker.
Yeah, I heard about that too. Yeah, he was upset about that.
We can't really confirm that, and you know, if Mr. Leto would love to join us on the podcast, we'd love to have him.
If you're ever in Jersey,
shoot us a message on dissectingfiction.com. That's really it for the cinematic Joker. Like we said, we have a lot of other Batman topics we're probably going to get into. I think we opened a lot of doors today for other ones. So if there's anything you'd especially like to hear us talk about, please comment. If you are on one of the platforms that doesn't allow you to comment, you can always check us out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. We're on most social media. We're on most podcast platforms. So if you're listening to this on YouTube or a platform that you don't feel like using tomorrow, see if you can find us.
Yeah, we're pretty out all over the web right now, which I think is probably our most successful thing about October.
Yeah, no, October was a big month for us, and now in November, we're only going to get bigger. But once again, I am Vinny Murphy.
I'm Christian Cutluck.
And thank you for listening.